For all these years, I thought it was a joke that scientists broke apart atomic bombs with their hands to prevent nuclear explosions. Until one day, someone told me that this actually happened. The bomb that was broken apart with bare hands turned out to be the twin brother of the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Twice in the lab, that bad boy came this close to explode, and it was only because some scientists rolled up their sleeves and pried it open that disaster was averted. They called that atomic bomb the Demon Core, and it killed at least 2 top-notch scientists. So today, let's dig into the real story behind the Demon Core. Let's jump back to July 15th, 1945. A mysterious bomb was being hoisted. The code name for this operation was Trinity, and this bomb, codenamed Big Boy, carries the number 1 core. The U.S. Air Force decided it was too long to carry across the Pacific. So Oppenheimer, the lab director, wanted it to be used as an experimental bomb. One afternoon, Oppenheimer's 2 right-hand men were hoisting the bomb, and that's when they snapped this photo. The dude wearing sunglasses was Slotin, and the guy sitting behind him was Daghlian. The next morning at 5:29, a red mushroom cloud soared over the white desert, marking the success of humanity's first nuclear explosion test. After the successful nuclear blast, all the scientists turned to Oppenheimer, eager to know what he thought. Then Oppenheimer quoted a sentence from the Indian epic, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The following 8 months proved Oppenheimer right. Even the once defiant Japanese emperor who vowed never to surrender ended up signing the surrender document. Then Oppenheimer left the desert lab, but his assistants continued experimenting with the Demon Core, not knowing just how powerful it really was at the time. The Demon Core is a 6.2 kilograms bomb made up of 2 plutonium-gallium hemispheres. It's now in a subcritical state. Once it crosses the supercritical state and reaches the critical state, it will trigger nuclear fission. At first, it unleashes intense neutron radiation and a blue glow. If the fission can't be stopped at this point, it releases a massive amount of energy and radiation, basically wiping out everyone in the vicinity. On August 21st, before Japan even had a chance to sign the surrender papers, the Demon Core went haywire. One evening, Harry rushed back to the lab, all by himself. In fact, all the scientists got off work very early that day and planned to grab a drink together. But halfway through, Harry got a sudden burst of inspiration. So, he ditches the crew and races back to the lab to conduct an experiment. The lab is totally empty, not a soul around except for the security guard posted at the entrance. Harry surrounded the Demon Core with tungsten carbide bricks, fully focused on this risky experiment to go from a subcritical state to a supercritical state. The basic idea behind the experiment was that after the 2 plutonium-gallium hemispheres are brought together, the core will enter a subcritical state and begin to emit neutrons outward. By controlling the flow of neutron and reflecting them back into the core will reach a critical state, initiating nuclear fission. At this point, the core becomes like a ticking atomic bomb, ready to explode, releasing energy and radiation. Harry used his own hands to precisely manipulate the reflector, those tungsten carbide bricks, creating a small passage for neutrons, preventing them from flowing back into the core. He had already done this experiment dozens of times, confident that nothing unexpected would happen, because he believed in his ability to handle it precisely. Meanwhile, the security guard at the entrance was sitting there bored, completely unaware that just 3 meters away, that mad scientist was manually controlling a nuclear explosion. It's hard to imagine what he would have done if he knew what was going on in the laboratory. And then, right at that moment, Harry's hand shook. A small piece of tungsten carbide fell onto the core, making a noise and alarming the security guard. The guard looked around, but little did he know, that piece of tungsten carbide had just blocked the channel for the flow of neutrons. The oscilloscope readings skyrocketed. The core emitted a blue glow, indicating that nuclear fission had started. Harry had only a few seconds to stop the fission, and without thinking too much, he reached out and picked up that piece of tungsten carbide, allowing neutrons to flow out of the core again, and nuclear fission promptly stopped, with the oscilloscope returning to normal. At this point, the security guard stood up and asked if Harry had to fill out a form to record the accident just now. It was only then that Harry realized there was someone else at the lab entrance, so he yelled at him to leave immediately. Unbeknownst to the guard, just moments ago, his body had been hit by neutron radiation, and Harry, who was at the radiation center, had received a radiation dose tens of thousands of times above the limit. Harry's genes had already broken, his immune system was collapsing, and his time was running out. A few hours later, a doctor took a photo of Daghlian. In the photo, the burns and blisters on his hand looked horrific. 25 days later, Harry succumbed to radiation poisoning at the age of 24. As for the security guard, who knew nothing about the incident, he died of acute leukemia at the age of 62, 33 years later. Later on, the guy with sunglasses took over Harry's job. His name was Louis. Louis was even more of a fearless madman. You'd always catch him in the lab rocking his signature blue jeans and cowboy boots, wielding a screwdriver, ready to tinker with the Demon Core. Back in college, he was an amateur boxer, taking on challengers at various universities. After graduating, he saw action in Spain, even helping the Royal Air Force in the UK test out new fighter jets. And of course, he had his hand in assembling atomic bombs in the New Mexico desert. At the time, Louis was just 35, and he made light of the power of atomic bombs. He improved Harry's experiment, crafting two hemispherical covers using beryllium to encase the Demon Core, then used a screwdriver to pry open the two hemispheres. With his other hand pressing down on one of the hemispheres, he fearlessly used his hands to control the gap between them, essentially managing the flow of neutrons manually. Once his screwdriver slips, the gap between the hemispheres would suddenly close, and all the neutron flow would rush back into the core. The core would instantly reach a critical state and trigger nuclear fission. In this seamless casing, the neutron radiation from the fission would be more intense than what Harry's experiment produced. At that time, another big shot in science, Fermi, had warned Louis, telling him he was poking a sleeping dragon's tail. If he did not stop immediately, he'd be dead within a year. But Louis believed in himself. He believed that fate was in his own hands, just like his screwdriver. It wouldn't slip. He had even performed his screwdriver technique in front of others more than 10 times. However, after Harry's accident, the US military issued a rule that all supercritical experiments must be conducted in the presence of at least 2 scientists, and they added alert systems to all oscilloscopes, upgrading security measures. But the US military forgot to specify that scientists shouldn't handle things directly with their bare hands. Before the year predicted by Fermi, 9 months after the Daghlian accident, which happened to be the 21st, that flash of blue light appeared in the laboratory again. On that day, there were a total of 8 scientists in the laboratory, each one nervously preparing for this experiment. Louis used his screwdriver to control the neutron flow channel as usual. He was very careful, gradually narrowing the gap of the neutron flow with his hand. And during this process, he also obtained a lot of experimental data. However, just as the experiment was about to conclude, one scientist went to get a form, and there happened to be a cup of coffee on top of it. In the moment the form was picked up, the coffee spilled. This unexpected event startled all the scientists, and Louis too was shaken, causing his hand to tremble. At the same time, the screwdriver slipped, and the 2 hemispheres closed instantly. A blue glow illuminated the entire laboratory. Without hesitation, Louis stood up, braved the heat wave, and immediately used his bare hands to pry the 2 hemispheres apart. The blue glow disappeared, and the fission stopped. In less than half a second, Louis looked at his hands, knowing that he was about to die. Right after that, Louis suddenly shouted loudly, telling everyone not to move, and threw a piece of chalk to each person, instructing them to mark their positions when they were hit by radiation. Then, Louis wrote formulas on the blackboard, calculating the radiation dose while smoking, urgently leaving more first-hand medical clues for the doctor before his body collapsed. After finishing the calculations, he discarded the chalk and said, "No one received a lethal dose of radiation, except for me." Then he lit another cigarette and said, "I'm as good as dead." As soon as he left the laboratory, Louis started vomiting. He described his mouth feeling sour, like having a giant lemon stuffed in it. In the hospital, many volunteers donated blood for Louis, but radiation had already destroyed his DNA. His body couldn't produce new cells, and his immune system began to collapse. But his consciousness was still awake, and he could only watch as his body deteriorated step by step. On the 9th day after the accident, Louis passed away in a specially designed oxygen tent made by the doctors at the age of only 35. Later, doctors discovered that Louis had shielded most of the radiation with his body at the scene, saving the lives of the other 7 people. It was also thanks to Louis's agile response, using his hands to pry open the 2 hemispheres so as not to cause more severe consequences. After these records were made public, a historian compiled the entire story and named it Revenge of the Third Core. He mentioned that the 3 plutonium cores produced under the Manhattan Project in top-secret conditions were encased in a small box made of magnesium. No one knew just how terrifying they were. The first core was detonated in the Trinity test, leaving Oppenheimer lamenting that he had become the Grim Reaper. The second core was detonated over Nagasaki. The third core sought revenge in the laboratory. Subsequently, it was placed back into an atomic bomb, and on July 1st, 1946, it was taken to Bikini Atoll for an underwater nuclear test. However, it encountered an accident en route, and the military has yet to declassify the specific details. What we know is that the military temporarily canceled the experiment. Upon returning to the United States, the military promptly melted down the third core, and its materials were later used in the production of other cores. By compiling declassified information from various countries, we've discovered that from 1945 to the present, there have been 60 similar criticality accidents worldwide, resulting in 21 direct fatalities. Perhaps as Oppenheimer suggested, atomic bombs are indeed a force of death that humanity struggles to control.